Hi all, let's look at gene inheritance of genes or modes of inheritance. Okay, this is the first in 3 sets of PowerPoints you'll get, all about the inheritance of genes, and the first one is all about complete dominance. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to define what a dominant and a recessive allele is. And by the end of the lesson, you should be able to demonstrate your understanding of inheritance of genes using Punnett squares. Remember, you are the product of a combination of 2 haploid cells, your egg cell from your mother and the sperm cell from your father. Each contain one set of 23 chromosomes. When they fuse at conception or fertilization, the zygote, that first cell that made you, is then a diploid cell. And from then it goes through a stage of mitosis, or several thousand stages of mitosis to produce that baby, the child, the adult, the teenager, which is then a diploid animal. All right, what is an allele? Before we get into alleles, I just want to remind you of what a gene is. So remember, a gene is a stretch of DNA, and that stretch of DNA codes for one particular protein. It's those proteins that then are made in your body that contribute to your physical characteristics, and sometimes we call those physical characteristics traits. Okay, so a gene is a stretch of DNA that codes for a protein. It's found on a chromosome. And if we look at these two chromosomes are what we call homologous chromosomes of the individual. Okay, one has come from the mother, let's just call that the pink one, and one has come from the father, let's call that one the purple one. Okay, so an allele is just a variation on a particular gene. I like to think of it as an analogy like ice cream. Ice cream is the gene, and the alleles are all the flavors of the ice cream. Okay, so in this set of homologous chromosomes, one chromosome comes from the mum, and we call that the maternal homologue. And the other one comes from the father of the individual, and we call that the paternal homologue. And you can see that the mother's homologue, or mother's chromosome, has 4 labelled genes, capital A, capital T, lowercase r, and lowercase b. The father's homologue has 4 genes, 2 in the same location on the chromosomes, except his alleles are slightly different. He's got lowercase a, capital T, lowercase r, and lowercase b. Okay, remember that the same gene is found at the same place or same location on homologous chromosomes. So that location where the genes are found is called a locus. And here we have 4 locus, or 4 loci on these homologous chromosomes. Okay, loci is the plural form of locus. It just means the location of the gene on the chromosome. So we can see that these homologous chromosomes have 4 loci, locus 1, locus 2, locus 3, and locus 4, although I can see a green set up there as well, which are unlabeled. Okay. When we look at alleles, those variants on those genes, we have to denote them with a letter that represents what that gene is all about. Okay. In this case, we've got gene 1 at locus 1, and it has 2 alleles, or this individual has 2 alleles, one from mum and one from dad. And they have an uppercase letter and a lowercase letter. And the uppercase letter denotes or represents the dominant allele. And the lowercase letter represents a recessive allele. Okay, so this individual has different alleles at locus 1. I can see he or she has got a capital and a lowercase at locus 1. And also at locus 4, there's a capital and a lowercase as well. They also have the same alleles at locus 2 and 3. So gene 2 and gene 3, there's a capital T and a capital T, and a lowercase r and a lowercase r. Okay, here we have a mother and a father. You can see that they have got their chromosomes and their gametes. The male's got their sperm and the female has the egg gametes. And of course the father, he's got blue eyes. He's only got an option he's got 2 alleles in his cells. And to make a sperm, we know it's a haploid cell, so he's only going to have the option to donate one of those types of alleles. And of course, they're the same, so he's only got the option to donate exactly the same one to both sperm, or these are his possibilities. Okay, the mother has blue eyes, which are represented by the recessive allele, little b, and another one, little b. And so she has no option but to donate the same allele to her offspring. Okay, the offspring here then receives the brown allele from the dad and the blue allele from mum. And so this person here has a dominant allele and a recessive allele for brown eyes and for blue eyes. Okay, let's look at what a genotype is. So a genotype is the set of alleles that an individual has at one particular locus. For example, this genotype of this individual at locus 1 is capital A, lowercase a. Okay, so the genotype is literally just two letters. It is either going to be a capital and a lowercase, or it's going to be a capital and a capital, or it's going to be a lowercase and a lowercase. Genotype is just two letters. Okay, so it's how we mix those letters up that denotes whether or not, or how they represent those physical characteristics. So remember, we represent a dominant allele with a capital and a recessive with a lowercase, and it's the combinations of these dominant and recessive alleles in a genotype. They have really important names, and you need to learn these names. So let's look at the first one. Homozygous dominant means that the genotypes have the same alleles and they're both the dominant variety of allele. So that means they're both the capital letter. So where does this individual have a dominant homozygous combination? It is at locus 2. Homozygous dominant, capital T, capital T. Okay, this individual is also homozygous at one of these, homozygous recessive at one of these locus. Homozygous recessive means the genotype has the same alleles and they're both recessive this time, so they're both lowercase. And I can see that this individual is homozygous recessive at locus number 3, lowercase r. And the last type of combination is heterozygous, where we have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. The dominant allele is always written first. So at locus 4, we can see that this individual is heterozygous for this gene. I don't know what this gene is. It could be for being bald, or I don't know. So big B and little b. So it has a dominant allele and a lowercase allele. And also this individual's heterozygous at locus 1 as well. And when we write the genotype, we always write the dominant allele first, and then we do the recessive allele. Okay, so let's look at what a phenotype is. Genotype and phenotype, you're going to need to remember what the difference between these two things are and how to write them. So if a genotype is the set of two alleles inherited from your parents, what is a phenotype? So the phenotype is just the physical characteristic that your genotype produces, or your physical trait. So in this lesson, we are looking at the complete dominance of alleles. This means that the dominant allele, represented by that capital letter, always overshadows or masks the production of the recessive allele. And that dominant one always determines the phenotype in the individual, so what that individual looks like. For example, in this genotype of the individual that has big B, little b, down the very bottom here, that's man with big B and little b, where big B stands for brown eyes and little b stands for blue eyes, then the dominant big B will overshadow the recessive little b, and the individual will only produce brown pigment and have brown eyes. Okay, so that little b, the blue allele, won't produce any blue protein. His genotype would be obviously big B, little b. His phenotype, what he physically looks like, his eyes, they would be brown, and his allelic combination would be heterozygous. Now remember, hetero means the same. So hetero, like heterosexual, they don't mean the same. Heterosexual means different, so I can see that these two alleles are different. Okay, and so I can remember that hetero means that they have two different alleles. Okay, Here, let's look at this lady up the top here. She's also got brown eyes, but she has a different genotype, and that's because she received 2 dominant alleles, one from each of her parents. So she's got no option but to produce brown pigment for her brown eyes. Her genotype is a big B, big B. Her phenotype obviously is brown eyes, but she has a different allelic combination than this person down the bottom. She's homozygous dominant. Remember, she's homozygous. Homo, like homosexual, means the same. Okay, she's got 2 of the same alleles, and they're both dominant. So that's why we call her homozygous dominant. Okay, unlike this man over here, he is also homozygous, but he's homozygous recessive. He's got 2 of the same alleles, but they're both recessive blue-eyed alleles, and so therefore he's got no dominant allele to mask that blue pigment from being made, and so he'll end up having blue eyes with a genotype of little b, little b. Okay, just a little note down here that in some questions you might see this term pure breeding or pure bred. That means that the genotype of that individual who is a purebred animal or a purebred person means that the genotype will be either homozygous dominant, where their alleles are the same, or homozygous recessive, where their alleles are the same. Purebreeding means that the alleles will be exactly the same. It won't be the heterozygous version. Okay, so if identical twins and triplets or identical multiple births, have exactly the same genes and alleles as we've been taught, have the same genes and alleles as each other, why is it that they don't always look exactly alike? And I've noticed this, I'm sure many people have noticed that as time goes by, you can see differences in their physicality of multiple births. So you can identify or try and pick out who is who. And it's really evident as they start to grow older. And you can see that there are some differences between multiple births or identical births. Why is this? So it used to be an idea that the individual's genotype, their genes, their DNA alone contributed to the way they looked or how their physical characteristics played out. But now it's widely accepted that it's your environment that also plays quite a large role in the way you look or how your genes are expressed. So even growing up in the same house, identical siblings, identical twins or triplets can look slightly different due to environmental factors. So each individual is an individual. They don't have exactly the same experiences or eat the same thing all the time. So due to environmental factors such as diet, exercise, sleep, social relationships, things that you might ingest, like alcohol or drugs or childhood experiences, culture and lifestyle, they will all have an effect on your expression of genes and so therefore have an effect on your phenotype. Here's a few more examples of dominant characteristics versus recessive characteristics. You might like to think about ones that you have or ones that run in your family. I think this one here down here is cut off. This is albinism, a recessive trait. Okay, this is one of your success criteria, is to be able to use a Punnett square and to calculate probabilities of genetic inheritance. So we have quite a few examples of crosses or matchings between a mother and a father. In this case, we have a heterozygous brown-eyed mother and a heterozygous brown-eyed father. So heterozygous, they've got 2 different alleles, one for brown and one for blue eyes, and the same for the father. Okay, so these are possible outcomes for their children. Now, they don't have to have had 4 children. They could have only just had 1, or they could have had 12. Yeah. So these are the possible outcomes for all of their children. If you've ever done a probability tree before, it's similar to a probability tree. Okay. Except in science, we use a Punnett square. So in a Punnett square, we leave that space blank. Okay. And then this space here, we put down one of the parents' genotypes. So we separate the big B, we put it at the top, and then the little b recessive down the bottom. And then we'd put the other parent's genotype on the top up here. okay, or the side and the top. Now, I've put the father on the top, the mother on the side. It doesn't matter which way you do it. You can flip them or you can leave them. That's up to you, okay? And then we're basically just using drag and drop, kind of like plotting coordinates on a Cartesian plane, where the father's allele, big B, will place into this box and also into this box, and then this allele will drop and drag and drop into this box and also into this box. And then the mother's allele will do the same for her. So the dominant allele will go into this box and into this box. And then this allele here will drag and drop into this box and into this box. And then we'll see what probable or what the chances are of having a child with different genotypes are. So we end up in the end having 3 different types of genotypes. We've got a big B combination here. We have a little b combination here, and then we have 2 chances of getting a heterozygous big B, little b here and here. Okay. Now each of these squares is worth 25%. Okay. So we can say that 25% of the probability would be to have a baby or an offspring that has homozygous dominant alleles, a genotype, big B, and then 25% of our probability would be to have an offspring that had homozygous recessive little b offspring. And then we have 25% plus 25%, 50%, which would be the heterozygous form of big B, little b. Okay. Now, how many of those probabilities would result in having a blue-eyed child? A blue-eyed child? Well, remember, the blue-eyed child has to have both of the blue alleles, and so there's only a 25% chance of that happening out of this particular cross. Okay, the rest of the children, even though their genotypes are different, they'll all have brown eyes because they have that dominant allele. Okay, and we represent that using a table that looks like this. Okay, so in these examples, there's a few more in the next pages. We're going to represent these using a table that looks like this. So we're going to list all the possible genotypes. In this case, there's 3 possible genotypes, and we look at listing their percentage probability as well. And then from the possible genotypes, we try and convert that into a ratio. So here we have the ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 for the dominant brown eyes, the heterozygous brown eyes, and the recessive blue eyes. Okay. What are the possible phenotypes? Well, this one looks like it's going to have brown eyes for sure, so that's why we list brown eyes here. This one, heterozygous for brown eyes for sure, yep, and that's why we have a phenotype of brown eyes here. And then we have a recessive blue-eyed child, and then we list down blue eyes here, okay? But out of all of them, we have a phenotypic ratio of, not 2 to 1, 3 to 1. That should be 3 to 1. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3 blue-eyed children and 1, 2, 3 brown-eyed children rather, and 1 blue-eyed child. So that should be a 3 to 1 phenotypic ratio. Here's our allelic combinations. We've been through that already. Oh, and the last thing is, if each of these is worth 25%, these probabilities, then altogether we should always reach 100% total. Okay, so if we have a heterozygous mother and heterozygous father, we've crossed that, and these are all of our different types of combinations or probabilities. Let's look at another combination. Here we have a heterozygous brown-eyed father crossed with a homozygous blue-eyed mother. So what are the probabilities of having a blue-eyed child or a brown-eyed child? So here we have the father's alleles up the top and our mother's alleles down the side. We drag and drop them into place. And then we see that we can have a probability of 2 children, or 50% of our children might have brown eyes. Okay, because we've got the dominant allele here that masks the blue allele here. So the other 50%, 25 plus 25%, must be the probability of getting a blue-eyed child. Okay. And the next combination is having a homozygous brown-eyed mother, where both of her alleles are the same, with a homozygous blue-eyed father, where his alleles are the same, but for the recessive allele. What are the probabilities of having a blue-eyed child or a brown-eyed child? Well, if we drag and drop them into the Punnett square, we can see that all of the options for our children are all going to contain the brown-eyed dominant allele from the mother. So all of the children in this match will always have brown eyes. Okay, I want you to study this little family tree here. Okay, you can see that the big B for brown eyes and little b for blue eyes can be used to represent the genetic code for eye color in the Davis and the Swift families. And you can see that every time the individual has a dominant allele, the big B, they end up having the brown eyes. Okay, key questions. Janelle is heterozygous for the recessive trait of attached earlobes. How could the alleles for this trait be written? Okay, remember she's heterozygous. That means that she's going to have two different alleles. And whenever we write down a genotype, we're going to look to see what the trait is. And the trait here is attached earlobes. Okay, so remember we write down a letter that might represent earlobes. So let's write down, or attached earlobes. Let's write down a capital A for attached earlobes. Okay, now she's heterozygous for the recessive trait of attached earlobes. So the recessive trait is a little a for recessive for attached earlobes, and the dominant allele must be not attached earlobes. So the dominant allele would be, let's do big E for dominant earlobes and a little e for attached earlobes. Okay, how could the alleles for this trait be written? Well, we could do a dominant big E for attached earlobe not attached earlobes, and then a small e for the attached recessive trait. So what would Janelle's phenotype be? She says she's heterozygous for the recessive trait. Okay, so that would be, her phenotype would be, well, she would have to have the not attached earlobe. So if she's heterozygous, then she would have to be big E, little e. Okay, I want you to have a go at questions 2 and 3, and then there is also a worksheet attached to our Google Classroom as well. I want you to have a look at having a go at that and let me know if you have any questions.